Welcome, everyone, to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. We have a somewhat different crowd than we sometimes have, and I'm very glad of that because it means we're reaching out in ways that we haven't always successfully done, and it means we're addressing issues that we haven't always had the chance to do. And today's issue on the role of women as a driver of growth and what government policy in the US, at the IMF, what the business community can do about that is of critical importance to all our fates. So it is my distinct pleasure to have here today all of you. As you're all aware, we're going to get an overall address on this topic by Heidi Crebo-Rediker, the chief economist of the US State Department. I'll introduce her in a moment. That will be followed by remarks by two other distinguished leaders who happen to be women and happen to have worked on this issue. Minouche Shafiq. Sorry, I'm supposed to look at my notes. Minouche Shafiq, Deputy Managing Director at the IMF, and Carly Fiorina, the first woman to lead a Fortune 20 company, the former CEO and chairman of Hewlett-Packard. So let me encourage all of you who are finding your way to your seats to do so, and I will just say a few words of remarks about Heidi Crebo-Rediker. Heidi is a friend to many in this room, which in itself is a statement. In Washington, very few people have so many real friends as Heidi does. That is an earned quality. We're delighted that her husband, Doug Rediker, who has almost as many friends, is a visiting fellow here. But more importantly, perhaps on the professional side, I do want to repeat, she is the first person to hold the title of chief economist at the US State Department. After many years of distinguished and occasionally not so distinguished people as Undersecretary for Economic Affairs, including our dear friend Dick Cooper, the founding advisory board member here at the Institute, it was decided that the secretary needed more direct support and more direct advice and advocacy and representation in the economic issues that affect deeply American foreign policy in the world. And for those of you who know interagency meetings, that meant you had to have someone who was sharp, who was forceful, who was hardworking, who was diplomatic, and who had the complete trust of the secretary. And all those things were something that Heidi Crebo-Rediker has had as the first chief economist of the US State Department. Previously, before joining the State Department in that role, which I was one of several people to acclaim her for, she was chief of international finance and economics for the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, where she also advised then Senator John Kerry. And she has spent nearly 2 decades as a senior investment banker, including doing some really exciting work that I would have been scared to do in emerging markets in Russia and the transition economies of Central and Eastern Europe, going back to living on Sakhalin Island when Sakhalin Island was a little less of a pleasure spot than it even is now. Heidi is going to address us directly on a practical note, on a finance note, about how to think about the role of women as drivers of growth. Then we will have our distinguished discussants and open it up for Q&A from the floor. So Heidi, please.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining me here today, joining Adam and joining Minouche and Carly. And it's really a pleasure to be here, and especially to talk about this topic. It's a fairly new crowd. I think I've been to many of these Peterson lunches, and as Adam rightly noted, there's a slight difference in the makeup of the crowd today, and I think that's probably a good thing. So the speech today is on pushing forward gender-driven growth. So growth is probably the most pressing issue that we can talk about on every policymaker's mind in the world today. How do we get it? How do we sustain it? How do we make it inclusive? And how do we ensure that it generates jobs? Whether we look at infrastructure investment, eliminating trade barriers, investment in education and research, fostering entrepreneurship, better tax policy, there is no silver bullet. but we should explore every avenue, all possible means of raising growth. And perhaps the solution is actually right in front of us. Recent studies suggested OECD countries, if they saw full convergence of men and women in our labor force, would benefit from an overall increase of 12% of GDP over the next 20 years. So the question is, how do we get there? Gender and its relevance to macroeconomic policy is a relatively new field. And while work has been done on the data and analysis front in recent years, the topic is really still in its early days. Tackling gender in the field of human rights and development dates back decades. Good data and analysis led to mainstreaming of policy at places like the UN, at the World Bank, at regional multilateral development banks, at the State Department, and at USAID, as well as with many donor governments around the world. I think this provides the IMF with a tremendous opportunity to do the same exercise when it provides the economic assessments of countries around the world. The IMF has certainly ramped up in recent years the dialogue with member countries on issues like inclusive growth and on labor markets, and more research is pointing again and again to women as key to driving economic growth. To the extent that the IMF can mainstream gender might actually prove decisive to getting us there. Christine Lagarde has said more women at work means good news for the global economy, and I could not agree more. The IMF is pushing forward the gender-driven growth agenda in a very important economy right now, namely Japan. Japan's latest Article 4 assessment highlighted the need to increase women's participation in labor markets to stem their own demographic decline and drive their future growth. Christine Lagarde personally advocates on this issue. Full integration of women in the Japanese economy is now gaining attention at the top levels of government. Prime Minister Abe, who campaigned on increasing women's participation in Japan's economy to drive this future growth, has claimed that women are Japan's most underutilized resource. And Prime Minister Abe has rightfully placed the issue of improving women's participation in the economy as a growth imperative, squarely on top of the policy agenda as the third arrow of Abenomics. So in preparing for this speech, I sat down with a friend of mine who's a former IMF mission chief to brainstorm a little bit about how the IMF could further mainstream the issue of women as a driver of growth. Mainstreaming in other institutions took years to achieve, and the work is not done, and it required support from the top of organizations and member governments. The mainstreaming of gender policies within institutions, programs, budgets, and tax policies really counts. This is where the rubber hits the road, and the leadership does need to come from the top. That is actually why President Obama created the White House Council on Women and Girls early in his administration to place this particular issue at the highest level of the United States government. So while Japan could be a model, too many countries are not actually addressing this deficit. As you know, Article 4 assessments are like annual macroeconomic checkups for countries. And yet, and I did pose this to my friend at the IMF, we don't often see references to the inclusion of women in the economy in many other reports. Japan and countries like Italy, where we see female labor participation rates well below OECD peers, and where this issue actually was flagged as labor reform objectives in latest Article 4s, they are just not the only countries where women's economic participation is still too low. So my friend responded candidly. IMF mission chiefs focus on other priorities and are reluctant to push this particular topic because many senior economic officials really don't want to engage on this one, and because many mission chiefs don't see this as inside the mandate of the institution. So the issue of further integrating women in the economy comes rife with social and cultural overtones, which may be particularly problematic in those countries where women's economic participation is still most limited. And so the reluctance to move away from the safety of tried and true topics pushes this one off the agenda. All the more reason we need to push this conversation. Instead of focusing on the economic boost such integration would provide, the question of women in the economy is talked about only as a development issue. And yes, gender equality is core. It's a core development issue in its own right. And it is also a human rights issue. And we at the State Department are particularly sensitive to this, given former Secretary Clinton frequently and passionately argued that women's rights are human rights. But the narrative of women as drivers of economic growth remains a difficult sell, often eliciting defensive comments from senior economic policymakers. And I don't need to tell you, particularly this group, that excluding half of your resources from the economy, half of the world's consumers, half of the world's talent pool doesn't make economic sense. So thankfully, more and more governments understand that the inclusion of women in the economy is an imperative in and of itself, particularly in our current growth-challenged environment. And now some governments are looking to drive their own future growth and competitiveness by supporting those policies that will grow women's participation in the labor force, but they certainly need all the help they can get. So those agencies of government that often have the greatest impact, the ones that drive economic policy, budgets, taxing, spending, must also embrace these issues. This is true for both advanced economies and for emerging economies, although each has distinctive characteristics and their own distinctive challenges. Research from our colleagues in the private sector has been illuminating. Goldman Sachs has actually led some of the pioneering research on this issue over the past decade. And a paper this year entitled Women's Work, Driving the Economy, calculates how for advanced economies, demographic decline, combined with increased numbers of educated and highly skilled women workers in the labor force, can boost competitiveness and drive growth with very little incremental cost. So it's low-hanging fruit, and it can increase the tax base per retired person, it can increase the tax base relative to debt load, and it can help actually address pension sustainability, amongst other things. In emerging economies, Goldman's earlier research showed that narrowing the gender gap in employment could push income per capita as much as 14% higher than their baseline projections for emerging economies by 2020, and as much as 20% higher by 2030. So this is especially true in emerging economies with wider gender gaps, where the gender gap is of a systemic nature, where unequal access to education, capital, jobs, and markets is needed to achieve balanced growth. So my purpose today in speaking here is to highlight some of the cutting-edge work that is already underway to address this admittedly complex issue in both public and private sector institutions, and to make the case for broadening this very excellent work. And in doing so, I hope to shed a little light on the barriers that exist and lay down the challenge of integrating women more effectively into all aspects of the economy, to economic policymakers around the globe, and to those institutions who influence them the most. Because ultimately the case will be made and won when leading institutions from the IMF to Peterson, as well as private sector economists, engage to do the following: to systematically ensure that the discussion of women's economic participation becomes a standard and serious component of economic assessment, including it in discussions where it's relevant, where it makes sense, like tax policy and financial policy, budgeting and labor markets, just to name a few. Second, we need to improve the quality and the quantity of data around women's participation in the economy, demonstrating the obvious benefits we see from growth and competitiveness. We need to also mainstream the promotion of structural reforms and policy improvements that can address the barriers that prevent women's economic inclusion and accelerate increased participation. And last, we need to challenge those institutions and challenge those economic policymakers to make gender equality a top-line public policy priority. So much progress has been made since 1995 in Beijing, when then First Lady Hillary Clinton convincingly made the case for empowering women. And at the State Department, she made clear that empowering women was not only the right thing to do, but was the smart thing to do for economic growth. The Obama administration and the Department of State under the direction of Secretary Kerry, continues to empower women from a development, from a human rights, and from an economic perspective, both here at home and around the world. And we have not done this alone. We're certainly not alone in recognizing the significant economic force that women can bring to bear on our economies, and much of that work has been done with our multilateral partners. The World Bank, with an established tradition of looking at the microeconomic foundations of economic growth, has over the years generated much of the data we now use to analyze the role of gender in development. In fact, the World Bank devoted its 2012 World Development Report to a whole examination of gender equality in development. Of crucial importance, in 2001, the bank adopted a gender mainstreaming strategy, which was accelerated more recently through a promotion of a gender action plan. So last year, more than 80% of all loans and grants were funded through gender-informed operations. All country assessment strategies at this point are also gender-informed, which means each one systematically considers in its design, in its implementation, in its expected impact, and in its monitoring, gender and the issue of gender. And thanks to a notable Peterson Fellow and former head of the World Bank, Bob Zoellick, who ushered through many of these initiatives, the concept of gender equality as being good economics is much more broadly accepted around the world today. The OECD as well has provided a wealth of data and has been an exemplary partner, launching the OECD Gender Initiative in 2010 to examine existing barriers to gender equality in education, employment, and entrepreneurship. And again, we had strong support in this case from the State Department, strong encouragement and personal support from the Secretary. The culmination of this research was in the 2012 Closing the Gender Gap Analysis, which actually benchmarks 135 countries around the world for national gender gaps. The study showed a strong correlation between a country's gender gap and its national competitiveness, amongst other things. And likewise, OECD's 2012 Social Institutions and Gender Index, also launched at the State Department last year, went further to examine the underlying institutional drivers of gender inequality in the economy, some of the thornier barriers that dig deep into discriminatory social and cultural space that limit progress, including inequality in the family, limited property rights, access to credit, and political participation. The World Economic Forum has similarly made a value contribution in this discourse through its annual Gender Gap Report, which measures gaps between men and women in economic participation, as well as other metrics. Many consulting firms, investment banks, corporations, all are looking at how women positively impact corporate culture, risk-taking, consumption, and boardroom decision-making. The scope of our collective work and our efforts to address this gap continues to expand, and we are hopeful, but we are certainly not finished. Today, the efforts to empower women in the economy are fast becoming and shaping the discourse beyond development to the macroeconomic, and a growing body of quantitative research is making the case that this is actually the next frontier. As Ambassador Milan Verveer, someone I think many of you here know well, the first US ambassador at large for global women's issues, aptly put it, arguments based on GDP growth more persuasively speak to policymakers. We cannot underestimate the importance of getting this piece of the puzzle right, establishing a positive narrative as women as drivers of economic growth. And we find ourselves with a great opportunity today to properly assess women's role in macroeconomics, translate that into policymaking, and institutionalize it much in the same way we have done in the areas of development and human rights. The IMF has published many papers over the years that have touched on these very issues, but there's one in particular that I would like to highlight. In 2006, Janet Stotsky, who we have joining us today, published a survey at the IMF on the impact of gender on macroeconomic policy at a time when it was still a relatively unexplored issue, a testament to some of the early work that the fund has actually done in this area. She pointed out the need to further study the design of IMF structural adjustment programs to ensure that the benefits of economic growth were equitably shared. And she also pointed out that gender-based differences in behavior can influence macroeconomic variables like consumption, savings, and investment, and that reducing gender inequality could provide those macroeconomic benefits. Stotsky highlighted that the IMF may be able to contribute to reducing these gender inequalities by advocating greater gender neutrality in fiscal and especially tax legislation, in financial sector legislation, and by ensuring that government budgets recognize those special needs of women and girls and the disproportionate poverty in female-headed households. Christine Lagarde recently brought these issues to the forefront of the IMF's official voice. We are all trying to remove obstacles and create opportunities that will allow women to achieve their full potential, and in doing so, lift us all to a higher economic growth plane. The extent to which she and her colleague Manoush Shafiq, who's here today as well, and their colleagues can further engage and mainstream this issue could prove decisive. Having strong champions of closing the gender gap at the top of the IMF may be just what will ensure that gender is no longer seen as out of place in the discussions of macroeconomy. But it's a difficult task to define and create the right conditions necessary to unlock this full potential of women in the economy. What is clear at the macro level is that there is significant capacity for more work. And that can take us beyond how women have impacted growth so far and address what holds them back from further impacting growth across different countries. So I'd like to focus on one particular aspect of this issue, which is the differential participation of men and women in labor markets, and begin to look at this in advanced economies, given that this issue is very starkly coming to the fore as a result of lower trend growth after the Great Recession, as well as aging populations and other key demographic trends. So back in 2006, The Economist made, in their words, a back-of-the-envelope assessment that the increase in female employment in the advanced world had been the main driving force of growth in the past several decades. These women, they say, have contributed to more to global growth than have either new technology or the new giants, India and China. This is a remarkable statement. Since then, a multitude of organizations have pieced together parts of this gender growth puzzle with the goal of quantifying the impact increased numbers of women in the workforce had on economic growth and envisioning what advanced economies might just look like given a different trajectory. According to a 2011, back in the 1900s, according to a 2011 McKinsey report, unlocking the full potential of women in the US economy, there's about a 76% participation rate of American women, compared with, for example, 87% in Sweden, defined as either currently employed or actively seeking work. The report highlighted that between 1970 and 2009, we've seen a move of women holding 37% of all jobs to nearly 48%, an addition of almost 38 million more workers. And that same report estimated that without these women contributing to US economic growth, the US economy would have been 25% smaller in 2011. This is an amount that's equal to the combined GDP of Illinois, California, and New York. Other reports estimate that closing the existing gap between male and female employment rates in the US moving forward could boost US GDP by as much as 9%. So with the overall rate of female labor force participation in the US, it's actually amongst the highest in the world. There are some interstate variations. Again, in this report by McKinsey, the estimates were that if female labor participation rates were to rise for the average participation rate of the top 10 states, our economy would add another 5.1 million workers, or the equivalent of 3 to 4% increase in GDP. So even here at home, we still have a way to go, and we still have exciting potential to be unlocked. So the American labor force is highly correlated with higher education, and this is not unique to the United States. The OECD considered the impact of increased female education on economic growth between 1960 and 2008 over 30 countries, and found the increase in relative educational attainment of women had a positive and significant impact on average GDP per capita. They concluded that increases in educational attainment accounted for around half of economic growth in OECD countries. Turning to Japan, I have to give enormous credit to economist Kathy Matsui, who pioneered analysis in the growth of increased labor force participation in Japan over a decade ago, and she has been beating the drum ever since. Matsui published her first research called Womenomics in 1999, identifying the causal link between Japanese women's participation in the workforce and opportunity women presented for driving future growth. This was significant given the backdrop of Japan's shrinking overall population, its high fiscal debt, deflation, and increasing global competition. Given the high educational achievements of Japanese women in particular, and the limited alternatives, better inclusion of Japanese women could easily generate economic growth. As she noted, it's hard to run a marathon on just one leg. Over the past decade, female employment in Japan has risen to a record 60% in 2011. But compared to other peers in the OECD, other developed nations, Japan's ratio still ranks amongst the lowest. So why is this such a critical challenge, and why is this where the IMF has first turned its attention? Looking forward, Japan's total population is projected to shrink by 30% by 2055, the sharpest amongst advanced economies. When Matsui published her Womenomics 3.0 in 2010, she noted at the time the number of pets in Japan outnumbered children under the age of 15. On the same subject, a recent IMF paper, Can Women Save Japan?, sought to quantify the impact women could have on Japan's labor force. Female labor force participation is about 24% lower than of male peers. And they estimated that an increase in the female labor force rate to 70% would result in GDP per capita growth rates of 5%. Japan last achieved 5% growth in per capita GDP in 1990. More ambitious increases in the labor force in Japan to meet Northern European averages could generate yet another 5% in GDP per capita growth. So in light of the aging population, lack of in-migration, consequential labor force decline, and the expanded inclusion of women into the workforce, it is actually essential to slow the natural rate of decline in Japan's labor force. And this is not just true for Japan, it's true for other countries as well. Korea has a very similar labor participation gender gap, almost as large as Japan's, and could benefit from comparable increases. In Europe, some private estimates have shown a reduction of the employment gap has been one of the most important drivers of growth over the past 50 years. That closing this gap, we could see an additional 13% boost overall to GDP. The OECD estimates that closing this gender gap in labor market rates could add 11.2% GDP to Germany, 9.4 in France, and 22.5 in Italy. Even a gap that reduces this gap by 50% over the same period would lead to 5.6, 4.7, and 11.2 gains to GDP in those countries, respectively. Italy in particular stands out. Their participation rate is very low compared to other OECD peers and certainly compared to other European countries. I think Manoush might touch on that a little bit later today. But Germany, too, could see these initiatives increase the female labor force and pay dividends in the coming years as Germany has to deal with its own impending demographic challenge. Scandinavia's experience suggests that this type of outcome is achievable given the right policy environment and wider cultural acceptance of equal female employment. Particularly in aging societies, closing this gap could help address pension sustainability as well as broaden the general tax base. Given Europe's current growth challenges, this seems a real and obvious opportunity. In emerging markets, let me highlight a few regional differences and then I'll touch on some of the strengths and opportunities. In 2011, the rate of labor participation for females in Latin America was 52%. In South Asia, 35, and in MENA region, it was 26, which is the lowest in the world. And I want to distinguish here between the emerging markets and some developing countries whose challenges with women in the economy span far beyond just a growth challenge, where safety and health and basic education, human rights weigh large, and where fighting for fundamental equality is of utmost concern. But let me draw your attention to one of the more compelling pieces of research in emerging markets launched last year by Booz Allen called Empowering the Third Billion. It's a country-by-country analysis that addresses what will happen when an estimated 1 billion women, the third billion, enter the global workforce over the next decade. The third billion could play as significant a role as worker inflow from the billion-plus populations of China and India, but the report also highlights a lack of sufficient attention from governments, from business leaders, and other key decision-makers in many countries. Their estimates confirm that there is significant untapped economic growth potential from women's economic empowerment in emerging economies, and they rank those countries on how effectively they're empowering women as economic agents in the workforce. In earlier work in the same subject, Sandra Lawson wrote a report called Women Hold Up Half the Sky, which many of you might have seen, which looks at the BRIC countries and the N11, the next 11 emerging growth countries. She highlighted that countries with younger populations, rising gender equality is typically associated with the start of a period of rapid economic growth. The report also considered education and correlated macroeconomic effects such as more working women, stronger human capital and productivity, higher returns on investment, more productive agriculture, and concluded that education, again, is key to economic growth. They do go hand in hand. And conversely, low female education has been shown to be a contributing factor in slower economic growth. The BRICS and the N11 countries have been the prime engine of global growth over the past few years, and Lawson demonstrated just how significant equalizing of the labor force participation could be to drive future economic growth within these countries, and the obvious subsequent growth benefit for the global economy. So we must ask ourselves, how can we afford not to work towards this end? Having just touched on some important issues like education, I'd like to turn briefly to some of the other primary and well-established policy remedies to women's economic participation. In general, and most specifically geared to advanced economies, policymakers who are looking to adjust access to work policies to level the playing field and enhance flexibility must adopt non-discrimination policies, access to flexible work arrangements, and facilitate the transition from part-time work to full-time work. For example, in the Netherlands, the rapid increase in female labor participation was the result of a breakdown in barriers between full-time and part-time work contracts in the 1980s. We also need to look to enhance support for childcare and elder care, including parental leave benefits. For example, Sweden's high female labor participation rate can be mostly attributed to a very generous and flexible parental leave policy. We need to review tax codes to identify and remove provisions that discriminate against second earners. Many countries effectively impose a higher tax rate on secondary earners in a family, and those are usually women. In Canada, a decrease in secondary earners' tax contributed significantly to their increase in Canada's women's labor force participation rate between 1995 and 2001. So the challenges for emerging markets are markedly different. In emerging economies, we look to policies that introduce and enforce anti-discrimination laws, expand access to credit, bring informal participants into the formal economy, and of course, develop strong educational systems. Fostering entrepreneurship is especially key and has been a strong priority for the State Department, especially given the importance that SMEs can and do play for driving growth and employment. This is not an exhaustive list, nor are these new solutions, but they are necessary solutions if we're able to start to bridge the growth gap. In Middle East and North Africa transition countries in particular, women have played an important role in bringing about momentous changes, notwithstanding their limited economic role. Supporting stable and democratic transitions in Arab Spring countries is an important political as well as economic priority for the U.S. The successful transition of these countries will require developing a vibrant and broad-based economy that generates good jobs. Just as women helped initiate the Arab Spring, so too must they play a key role in ensuring the successful and sustainable transition, but only if they are integrated into the economy and that their full potential is realized. So the discourse of late has focused on how far we've come, the potential we have yet to tap, or the challenges we still face. But what about solutions and innovative approaches that have been pursued by the US government, by international organizations, and others? President Obama has made it clear across our foreign policy that we are most effective when we lead by example. The White House announced several commitments to increase economic opportunity for women and girls in the United States yet last year, and they have now all almost nearly been implemented. Those commitments were made at the Equal Futures Partnership, which is a multilateral initiative that is determined to break down barriers to women's economic and political participation. He appointed the first ever ambassador at large for global women's issues at the State Department to ensure that advancing gender equality would be fully integrated into the foreign policy of the United States. The State Department in particular has embraced, under Secretaries Clinton and Kerry, a leadership role in promoting the interests of women and girls around the world, where much of our attention on the economic issues has gone to support entrepreneurship, women and SMEs, through training, mentoring, providing credit, supporting access to markets and technologies, as well as tackling discriminatory laws and regulations, especially when it comes to property rights and inheritance. We've also had great success using existing multilateral platforms to further mainstream gender as an economic growth issue. For example, we worked closely with the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, APEC, to elevate the importance of women's economic participation as a key economic growth strategy. In 2010, advancing women's economic empowerment became a core component of the APEC Leaders' Growth Strategy, where leaders establish a public-private policy dialogue to dig deep into the critical issues lifting women's economic potential. And in 2011, the US hosted the first APEC Women and the Economy Summit. And all at that summit adopted the San Francisco Declaration, where they committed to taking concrete actions to address the barriers and proactive steps to advance women's economic participation across the region. The APEC example is important because it highlights how we can continue to integrate the issue of women as drivers of growth through new multilateral channels, and it illustrates how economies can begin incorporating women's economic participation into national and regional growth strategies. It provides an example that can be replicated in other parts of the world. There are also good ideas for mainstreaming gender that have been around for a while, but could benefit from a little ramping up. For example, the United Nations has championed gender budgeting for many years now, a mechanism that tries to institutionalize gender issues in government planning, programming, and budgeting by identifying those measures to address gender gaps in government policies and reflecting them in the allocation of domestic budgets. While many countries have embarked on gender budgeting policies, from Nigeria to Indonesia to the EU, work on this discipline is still somewhat outside of mainstream economic research. Placing it squarely within the mainstream would help to show that gender budgeting might actually be just good budgeting. So we need to look at ways to institutionalize some of these policies, and I would say that the IMF is actually a very well-placed organization to do so. Another issue, incentivizing through tax policy can and does provide a powerful driver of behavior in both advanced and emerging economies. For example, in Nepal, which actually ranks high on measures of gender inequality, is paving the way on including women in the economy through their tax system. The OECD's SIGI report last year singled out Nepal for introducing a tax exemption to incentivize families to share property with their wives, with their daughters, and with their sisters. These types of changes can, in time, improve gender equality in Nepal. And finally, we should keep a close eye on the evolving story about great potential that has yet to be realized in Japan. Prime Minister Abe intends to launch his third arrow with policies aimed at restructuring the economy, improving productivity, and increasing labor force participation by women. He's included a promise to create 250,000 daycare openings over the next few years, encouraging businesses to set a target of at least one female executive per company, and extending childcare leave from 1.5 to 3 years. I am extremely encouraged that Japan's leadership has decided to take this bold step forward. Much good work has to be done to further the objectives of women, with the United States taking the lead on mainstreaming this in our own work at home and around the world, but we still have a lot to do. I was hoping today to raise the awareness of the cutting-edge work that is already underway in the field of gender in the macroeconomy, and make the case for broadening this work, and maybe shed a little light on what still needs to be done. I would like to essentially lay down this challenge to economic policymakers around the globe and to those institutions that influence them the most. Going back again to Christine Lagarde, she said earlier this month, the IMF does have the expertise and can help, and where it doesn't, it can reach out to other institutions. She suggested the IMF could seek out gender-smart fiscal policies by examining how taxes and government spending affect gender equality and opportunities for women. And she challenged governments to dare to achieve a more balanced world. We also support institutions like the IMF as they dare to continue and expand their good work and make as relevant as possible the issue of inclusive growth, where gender is fully included in the work that it does. And let me close by circling back to where I began, growth. At the most recent G8 meeting, Prime Minister David Cameron captured the summit's theme by stating that today's greatest challenge is to restore strong and sustainable growth to the world economy. This year's G20 places the challenge of addressing the growth environment in the global economy at the very top of its agenda. And at the same time, the IMF just revised down again its global growth forecast for 2013. Robert Gordon, in a widely cited argument from last year, raised questions about whether economic growth is even a realistic goal for future generations, noting that a global economic growth that basically didn't exist before 1750, and questioned whether or not we're looking at future growth at all. Gordon's argument was that the history of growth is both recent and perhaps limited. Relatively recent industrial revolutions gave the world electricity, the internal combustion engine, running water, indoor plumbing, communications, entertainment, chemicals, petroleum, and these in turn fostered more limited one-off growth drivers, including the emancipating of females from the drudgery of carrying tons of water per year and allowing them to join the labor force. Gordon's predictions of a future of stagnant global growth may or may not be proven correct, but the inclusion of women as a central driver of economic activity and growth in both developed and developing economies around the world can certainly make sure that we will all have to wait a lot longer to find out. Ignoring half of the world's workforce, half of the world's economic power is only to achieve half of our potential. I hope when the topic of women and growth comes up between the IMF mission chief and some minister of finance, enabling women as a driver of global growth will soon be as meat and potatoes as economic issues such as tax policy and monetary policy. Thank you very much.